Idle Hour did not begin as a monument, a symbol, or a cautionary tale. It began as land, quiet and coastal, shaped by wind, salt air, and the slow rhythms of Long Island's South Shore. In the late 19th century, Oakdale was still defined by open space, bay views, and seasonal retreat rather than permanence. Wealthy New Yorkers had started looking eastward, away from the density of Manhattan, toward places where distance itself could function as a marker of status. Idle Hour would emerge from this movement, not as a sudden eruption of grandeur, but as the result of ambition gradually testing how much space, scale, and separation wealth could claim. The estate's origins trace back to the post-Civil War period, when industrial expansion and railroad growth made Long Island increasingly accessible. What had once been a rural landscape of farms and small villages began to attract members of the financial and industrial elite seeking summer estates. These were not yet the sprawling compounds that would later dominate the Gold Coast. Early properties were often modest by later standards, designed as seasonal refuges rather than permanent seats of power. Idle Hour followed this pattern initially, conceived as a private retreat rather than an architectural statement meant to dominate its surroundings. The first major transformation of the property came under the ownership of William K. Vanderbilt, one of the most prominent figures in America's most powerful family. By the time Vanderbilt acquired the estate, the name Idle Hour already suggested a philosophy of leisure, but Vanderbilt's vision expanded that idea dramatically. Leisure in his hands was not passive rest. It was curated withdrawal, a controlled environment where wealth could operate without intrusion. Oakdale offered proximity to New York City without visibility, an ideal combination for a man whose name carried both influence and scrutiny. Vanderbilt's arrival marked the beginning of Idle Hour's evolution from retreat to estate. Existing structures were expanded, grounds were reshaped, and the property's relationship to the surrounding landscape was carefully managed. This was not about creating a single dominant building yet, but about asserting control over space. Lawns, roads, and water access were all adjusted to serve a private logic. The estate became inward-facing, oriented toward its own routines rather than the nearby village or shoreline community. During this period, the idea of the American country estate was still forming. Unlike European aristocratic properties, which had evolved over centuries, American estates were being invented in real time by newly wealthy families. There were no inherited rules, only imported influences and personal preference. Idle Hour reflected this uncertainty. It borrowed from European traditions while remaining distinctly American in its scale and purpose. It was large but not ancient, private but not fortified. Its authority came not from lineage but from capital. Vanderbilt's use of Idle Hour reinforced this identity. The estate became a seasonal hub for social gatherings, political conversations, and family life, all conducted away from the pressures of the city. Guests arrived by train and carriage, entering a world carefully separated from ordinary concerns. This separation was essential. Idle Hour was not meant to impress the public. It was meant to insulate its owner. The absence of spectacle was itself a form of power. As the years passed, the estate grew more complex. Auxiliary buildings appeared. Infrastructure improved. Staff numbers increased. What had begun as a summer residence started to resemble a small, self-contained settlement. This growth was not accidental. Large estates required labor, coordination, and hierarchy to function smoothly. Idle Hour's physical expansion mirrored the organizational expansion needed to sustain elite life at scale. Servants' quarters, service roads, and utility systems developed alongside living spaces, mostly out of sight, reinforcing the illusion of effortless comfort. The late 19th century was a period of intense transformation in American society, and Idle Hour existed within these tensions. Industrialization created unprecedented wealth, but also deep inequality. While Vanderbilt and his peers withdrew into private landscapes, cities swelled with workers facing harsh conditions. The contrast between these worlds was stark. even if rarely acknowledged by those living behind estate boundaries. Idle Hour, like many such properties, embodied this contradiction. It was peaceful, orderly, and beautiful precisely because the chaos and labor that made it possible were kept elsewhere. Despite its growing scale, Idle Hour was still not the estate it would later become. Its architecture remained relatively restrained, reflecting a transitional phase between early country houses and the monumental mansions that would define the Gold Coast at its peak. This restraint, however, was temporary. As tastes shifted and competition among elite families intensified, the pressure to build bigger and more distinctive residences increased. Estates became statements, not just shelters. Idle Hour stood on the edge of this transformation, poised to change as its owners' ambitions evolved. The surrounding area of Oakdale also changed during this time. Improved transportation brought more visitors and development, subtly eroding the isolation that had initially attracted wealthy landowners. This created a paradox. The more desirable the area became, the harder it was to maintain exclusivity. For estates like Idle Hour, this meant either expanding further inward or redefining their relationship to visibility. The solution often involved architectural escalation, using size and design to reassert dominance over the landscape. Idle Hour's early decades established patterns that would shape its entire history. It was a place defined by adaptation rather than stasis, by ambition rather than nostalgia. Each phase of ownership would reinterpret what the estate was meant to be, layering new intentions onto old foundations. The land itself became a canvas for shifting ideas about wealth, privacy, and power, responding to changes in taste, technology, and social expectation. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the forces surrounding Idle Hour intensified. The rise of the American aristocracy, the increasing importance of public image, and the growing scale of private estates all pointed toward a dramatic transformation. Idle Hour had the space, the resources, and the precedent to evolve into something far larger than its original conception. What it lacked was only the decisive moment, the owner willing to push it beyond retreat and into monument. That moment was approaching. The estate's quiet beginnings, its careful expansion, and its strategic isolation laid the groundwork for a far more ambitious future. Idle Hour was no longer just a place to pass the season. It was becoming a symbol in waiting, shaped by land, money, and timing. The next phase of its history would test how far that transformation could go, and what it would cost to turn leisure into legacy. By the turn of the 20th century, Idle Hour was no longer merely a seasonal refuge shaped by convenience and discretion. It had become a platform for something larger, a property whose potential was increasingly obvious to its owners, and whose scale invited ambition rather than restraint. The estate still carried the quiet authority established during William K. Vanderbilt's tenure, but the cultural environment around it was changing fast, and the expectations placed on elite residences were escalating just as quickly. Idle Hour stood at the intersection of old money confidence and a new era of competitive display. The Vanderbilt family occupied a unique position in American society. Their wealth was not new, but it was not ancient either. Unlike European aristocracy, whose legitimacy rested on centuries of lineage, the Vanderbilts operated in a country that had to invent its own symbols of permanence. Architecture became one of the most effective tools for doing so. A grand house was not just shelter or comfort. It was proof of arrival. Idle Hour, up to this point, had been impressive but understated. That balance was becoming harder to maintain as other families along Long Island's South Shore began to build larger, louder, and more architecturally aggressive estates. This competitive atmosphere reshaped how Idle Hour was perceived internally. What had once been sufficient now risked appearing conservative. The estate's existing structures, while comfortable and well-appointed, did not yet command the kind of attention that newer mansions were beginning to attract. The Gold Coast was emerging, not as a geographic designation alone, but as a cultural arms race. Size, style, and extravagance were becoming measures of relevance. Idle hour could not remain unchanged without falling behind. Ownership transitions during this period further accelerated the estate's evolution. As the property passed into the hands of William K. Vanderbilt II, the philosophy guiding idle hour shifted. The younger Vanderbilt had grown up immersed in wealth, surrounded by estates that were larger and more elaborate than those of the previous generation. For him, idle hour was not the culmination of success, but an opportunity for reinvention. He inherited not just land and buildings, but expectations. Vanderbilt II approached the estate with a different sensibility. He was less interested in restraint and more attuned to the performative aspects of wealth. This did not mean constant public display, but it did mean that architecture and scale mattered more than they once had. Idle hour began to move away from its earlier identity as a private retreat and toward something closer to a statement property, one that could compete visually and symbolically with the most ambitious estates of its time. Expansion during this phase was deliberate. New buildings were added. Existing ones were modified or replaced. The estate's footprint grew, and with it, its internal complexity. Service infrastructure expanded alongside residential spaces, reflecting the increasing labor required to sustain elite life at this scale. The separation between public-facing areas and behind-the-scenes operations became more pronounced, reinforcing social hierarchies embedded directly into the landscape. The surrounding environment continued to play a critical role in shaping these decisions. Oakdale was no longer isolated in the way it had been just a few decades earlier. Improved rail connections made it easier for visitors to arrive, but also easier for outsiders to encroach. The very accessibility that had made the area desirable now threatened the exclusivity estates like idle hour depended on. In response, property boundaries were reinforced, sightlines controlled, and access points limited. Privacy had to be actively engineered. Idle hour's relationship with water also grew more important during this period. Long Island's South Shore offered not just scenic value but symbolic power. Water access signaled leisure, mobility, and sophistication. Yachting culture expanded rapidly among the elite, and estates with private docks or waterfront views gained prestige. Idle hour leveraged its coastal proximity to align itself with this culture, integrating maritime leisure into its identity and further distinguishing itself from inland properties. Social life at idle hour reflected these shifts. Gatherings became more formalized, less about casual retreat and more about hosting within a controlled environment. Guests were selected carefully. Events were planned with attention to optics as well as comfort. The estate functioned as a setting where alliances were reinforced and status subtly negotiated. Every detail, from arrival routes to dining arrangements, contributed to an unspoken narrative about power and belonging. Despite this increasing emphasis on scale and presentation, idle hour still lacked a single defining architectural centerpiece. It was an estate in transition, impressive but not yet iconic. This absence became more noticeable as the Gold Coast filled with mansions that left no ambiguity about their owners' intentions. Idle hour needed a focal point, a structure that could consolidate its identity and signal its ambitions without explanation. The broader cultural context made this almost inevitable. The early 20th century was a period of extreme confidence among America's industrial elite. Fortune seemed secure. Expansion felt endless. Architecture followed suit, favoring monumental forms and historical styles that suggested continuity and authority. Beaux-Arts classicism, with its emphasis on symmetry, grandeur, and reference to ancient power, became the language of choice. Idle hour was increasingly out of step with this trend, not because it lacked resources, but because it had not yet committed fully to the aesthetic logic of its time. Behind the scenes, discussions about transformation intensified. Architects were consulted. Designs were considered and discarded. The question was not whether idle hour would change, but how dramatically. Any major intervention would redefine the estate permanently, setting a course that could not easily be reversed. This required confidence, not just wealth. It required belief that the social order supporting such a project would endure. At the same time, the estate's internal operations continued to expand. Staffing levels increased, management structures formalized. Idle Hour functioned less like a home and more like an institution, complete with schedules, protocols, and specialized roles. This institutionalization was necessary to maintain the illusion of effortlessness that elite life demanded. Comfort at this level was never accidental. It was produced through constant coordination. As this phase drew to a close, Idle Hour stood on the brink of its most dramatic transformation yet. The land was ready. The resources were available. The cultural climate encouraged excess rather than restraint. What remained was the decisive act that would push the estate beyond adaptation and into reinvention. The quiet retreat of earlier decades was giving way to something far more assertive, an expression of wealth that would no longer hide behind discretion. The next chapter would reshape Idle Hour not just physically, but symbolically, turning it into one of the most ambitious private estates Long Island had ever seen. The transformation that Idle Hour had been circling for years finally became unavoidable once ambition, competition, and confidence aligned. By the early years of the 20th century, the estate was no longer judged by what it offered its owners in comfort or seclusion, but by what it communicated to the outside world. In an era when architecture had become a language of power, Idle Hour needed to speak fluently and loudly. The solution was not incremental expansion, but reinvention at a scale that would leave no ambiguity about intent. William K. Vanderbilt II committed to this shift with the kind of certainty only immense wealth could provide. The existing structures, while substantial, were now viewed as placeholders rather than foundations. Plans emerged for a mansion that would not merely sit within the estate but redefine it entirely. This would not be a house that grew organically over time. It would be conceived as a single, overwhelming gesture designed to dominate both landscape and conversation. The architectural vision drew heavily from European precedent, particularly the grand châteaux of France. This was a deliberate choice. French Renaissance forms carried associations of aristocracy, permanence, and cultural authority, qualities American elites were eager to appropriate. For families like the Vanderbilts, borrowing European architectural language was not about imitation, but translation, adapting Old World symbols to validate New World power. Idle Hour would become part of that translation. Construction on the new mansion marked a rupture with the estate's earlier identity. What had once been a retreat embedded gently into its surroundings now became a site of large-scale intervention. Land was regraded. Sightlands were engineered. The house was positioned not merely for views but for dominance, ensuring that its presence could be felt from multiple approaches. The estate's logic shifted from inward-facing privacy to controlled visibility, revealing just enough to assert superiority while still withholding access. The scale of construction was staggering. Materials were sourced from far beyond Long Island, chosen for durability, prestige, and visual impact. Stone, brick, and decorative elements were selected to convey weight and permanence. This was architecture meant to resist time, both physically and symbolically. The mansion was not designed for convenience or flexibility. It was designed to endure and to intimidate. As the structure rose, Idle Hour's internal organization became more rigidly hierarchical. The separation between family spaces, guest areas, and service zones was formalized through corridors, staircases, and hidden passageways. This spatial hierarchy mirrored social hierarchy, embedding class distinctions directly into the building's layout. Movement through the house was choreographed, ensuring that labor remained invisible while comfort appeared effortless. The estate's workforce expanded dramatically during construction and after completion. Skilled artisans, laborers, and domestic staff were required in large numbers, turning Idle Hour into a center of employment even as it symbolized exclusivity. This contradiction was fundamental to such estates. They depended on labor while erasing it from view. The mansion's grandeur was inseparable from the human effort required to sustain it, even if that effort was carefully concealed. When the new Idle Hour mansion was completed, its impact was immediate. It did not blend into the Gold Coast landscape. It redefined expectations. Its size, stylistic coherence, and level of ornamentation placed it among the most ambitious private residences in the country. The estate was no longer in competition with its neighbors. It had positioned itself above them. Social life at Idle Hour adjusted accordingly. The mansion's scale demanded a corresponding scale of entertaining. Dinners, receptions, and extended stays were no longer incidental pleasures but integral functions of the estate. Hosting became a form of performance, with architecture providing the stage. Guests were guided through spaces designed to impress in sequence, each room reinforcing the narrative of wealth, taste, and control. At the same time, the estate's isolation became more absolute. While Oakdale continued to develop, Idle Hour withdrew further into itself. Landscaping and controlled access ensured that the mansion remained visually and psychologically separate from its surroundings. The estate was not part of the community in any meaningful sense. It was adjacent to it, hovering above it both literally and figuratively. This period represented the peak of confidence for Idle Hour and its owners. The broader American economy was strong. Industrial fortunes appeared stable. The social order that allowed such estates to exist seemed secure. There was little reason, at least from within the mansion's walls, to anticipate disruption. The estate embodied the assumption that wealth, once accumulated at this scale, could perpetuate itself indefinitely. Yet even as Idle Hour reached this apex, the seeds of future vulnerability were already present. The mansion's very size and specificity made it inflexible. It required constant maintenance, a large staff, and a cultural environment that tolerated, if not celebrated, extreme displays of wealth. These conditions were not guaranteed to last. The estate's magnificence depended on a delicate balance of economic stability and social acceptance. Still, in this moment, Idle Hour appeared untouchable. It stood as a physical assertion that American wealth had matured into something resembling aristocracy. The estate no longer needed explanation. Its walls, towers, and grounds spoke for themselves. What had begun as a quiet retreat had become a fortress of leisure, a carefully engineered world designed to elevate its owners above ordinary concerns. The transformation was complete, but the story was not. Idle Hour had achieved the form it was meant to have, but form alone does not ensure survival. The mansion now carried the full weight of its ambition, and with that weight came exposure. The next phase of its history would test whether such a structure could remain viable once the cultural and economic forces that created it began to shift. The estate had become a monument. History would decide whether monuments could still function as homes, or whether they would be forced into entirely new roles. By the time Idle Hour settled into its fully realized form, the estate no longer functioned merely as a residence. It operated as a self-contained world with its own rhythms, rules, and expectations. Daily life within its walls followed patterns shaped by scale rather than intimacy. Mornings began not with quiet domestic routines, but with coordinated activity, as servants moved through corridors and service staircases to prepare rooms that might not be entered until hours later. Fires were lit, linens adjusted, meals planned well in advance, and the house itself slowly awakened, room by room, like a machine designed for comfort on an extravagant scale. William K. Vanderbilt II treated Idle Hour less as a personal sanctuary and more as a strategic base. From here he managed social obligations, business interests, and scientific pursuits, particularly his fascination with marine biology and yachting. The estate's proximity to the water reinforced this identity. Idle Hour was never disconnected from the sea, even when its owner was inside the mansion. Nautical interests influenced the rhythms of entertaining, the seasonal flow of guests, and the broader identity of the estate as a place tied to exploration, technology, and movement rather than static luxury alone. Social gatherings at Idle Hour became increasingly elaborate, but they were rarely chaotic. everything was curated. Guest lists were carefully composed to balance prominence, usefulness, and compatibility. The mansion's rooms allowed for separation and control, enabling multiple conversations, alliances, and negotiations to unfold simultaneously without friction. Formal dinners followed strict protocols, while informal gatherings were designed to appear spontaneous without ever actually being so. Nothing about Idle Hour's social life was accidental. Despite its size, the mansion maintained an atmosphere of exclusivity that bordered on isolation. Guests might stay for days or weeks, but the outside world remained distant. Newspapers arrived, of course, and telegrams connected the estate to global events, yet there was a sense that time moved differently within the grounds. The estate insulated its occupants from inconvenience, urgency, and unpredictability. This insulation was one of its greatest luxuries. The surrounding landscape was continually refined to reinforce this separation. Gardens were adjusted, paths rerouted, and sightlines reconsidered to ensure that views remained controlled. Nature at Idle Hour was not wild or spontaneous. It was arranged, disciplined, and aestheticized. Even the impression of effortlessness was carefully manufactured. Lawns appeared untouched despite constant maintenance. Trees framed the mansion rather than obscuring it. Every element served the same purpose, reinforcing the illusion of mastery. Within this environment, the mansion staff played a crucial but invisible role. Hundreds of individuals rotated through the estate over time, each trained to uphold standards that prioritized discretion above all else. Personal lives were secondary. The mansion demanded loyalty, precision, and silence. In return, it offered stability and prestige, though always on its own terms. The social hierarchy embedded in Idle Hour was not subtle. It was spatial, behavioral, and absolute. As the years passed, Idle Hour became a symbol not only of wealth but of a particular American moment. It represented a generation that believed progress and accumulation were endless, that technology and capital could solve any problem, and that private individuals could build legacies rivaling those of nations. The estate was admired, envied, and criticized in equal measure, though such criticism rarely penetrated its gates. Yet beyond the manicured grounds, the world was changing in ways Idle Hour could not fully control. Industrial labor unrest, political reform movements, and shifting attitudes toward wealth began to challenge the assumptions that had made such estates socially acceptable. While these changes did not immediately threaten Idle Hour's operation, they introduced a subtle tension. The mansion's scale, once a mark of success, began to read differently to those outside its orbit. Even within elite circles, tastes were evolving. Excessive ornamentation and rigid formality slowly gave way to preferences for comfort, efficiency, and understatement. Idle Hour, by contrast, remained unapologetically monumental. It did not adapt quickly, because adaptation was never part of its design philosophy. The estate was built to declare permanence, not flexibility. William K. Vanderbilt II himself embodied this contradiction. He was forward-thinking in certain pursuits, particularly science and technology, yet deeply traditional in matters of status and presentation. Idle Hour reflected this duality. It housed modern conveniences behind walls that echoed centuries-old European forms. The mansion looked backward even as it quietly incorporated innovation, a tension that defined much of American high society at the time. As seasons turned and years accumulated, the costs of maintaining Idle Hour became increasingly apparent. Financially, the Vanderbilt fortune could absorb these expenses, but the commitment required was relentless. The mansion could not be scaled down or partially closed without undermining its integrity. Idle Hour demanded full operation at all times. Lights, heat, staff, and supplies flowed continuously, regardless of how many rooms were actually in use. This rigidity made the estate vulnerable in ways that were not yet obvious. Idle Hour functioned beautifully under conditions of abundance and stability. It was far less suited to uncertainty or restraint. While the mansion still projected confidence, It was quietly becoming dependent on a world that was beginning to question the very values it embodied. Still, during this phase of its history, Idle Hour remained firmly in control of its narrative. It was a place of privilege, influence, and spectacle, operating exactly as its creators intended. Visitors left with reinforced perceptions of Vanderbilt dominance and American aristocracy. The mansion did its job well. What lay ahead, however, would test the limits of that design. The social, economic, and cultural shifts gathering momentum outside Idle Hour's gates would eventually force the estate to confront realities it had been built to ignore. The question was no longer whether Idle Hour was magnificent. It was whether magnificence alone could justify its existence in a changing world. As the 20th century pushed forward, the world outside Idle Hour accelerated in ways that made the estate's controlled isolation harder to sustain. What had once felt like distance now risked becoming disconnection. Railroads expanded, automobiles multiplied, and communication technologies compressed time and space. News traveled faster. Expectations shifted. The estate still stood vast and commanding, but the cultural environment that had justified its existence was slowly eroding beneath it, grain by grain, even if no one inside wanted to admit it. Idle Hour remained active, but its purpose subtly changed. Large-scale social spectacles became less frequent, replaced by smaller, more selective gatherings. This was not humility. It was calculation. The old rituals of excess no longer guaranteed admiration. Some circles they invited scrutiny. The Vanderbilt name still carried immense weight, but the automatic reverence of the Gilded Age was giving way to a more complicated mixture of respect, skepticism, and resentment. Idle Hour absorbed this shift without altering its physical form, which only sharpened the contrast. The estate's internal operations continued at full scale, an inertia built into its design. Staff numbers fluctuated slightly, but the underlying structure remained intact. Rooms were cleaned whether they were occupied or not. Grounds were maintained regardless of who walked them. Idle Hour did not know how to idle. It was either fully alive or deteriorating, and deterioration was unacceptable. This rigidity, once a symbol of discipline, became a liability disguised as tradition. William K. Vanderbilt II spent increasing amounts of time away from the estate, pursuing scientific interests and travel that reflected his broader curiosity about the world. Idle Hour in his absence became more symbolic than functional, a standing testament to an earlier phase of his life and status. The mansion no longer anchored his identity as tightly as it once had. It remained impressive, but it no longer defined him. This shift affected how the estate was perceived internally. Without its owner as a constant presence, Idle Hour operated more like an institution than a home. Decisions were delegated, routines hardened. The mansion began to feel less responsive, less personal. Even luxury, when automated, can become sterile. Idle Hour drifted into that condition quietly, without ceremony. At the same time, the broader American landscape was experiencing pressures that would soon become unavoidable. Economic cycles grew more volatile. Wealth concentration faced increasing criticism. The idea that private individuals should maintain estates of such scale began to feel, to some observers, less aspirational and more provocative. Idle Hour stood as an easy symbol for debates about inequality, even if it had been built before those debates reached full volume. None of this immediately threatened the estate's survival. Idle Hour was still well-funded, well-maintained, and well-protected. But the context around it had changed, and context matters more than architecture ever admits. The mansion had been designed to project confidence in a system that now required explanation. That difference would prove critical. As the years advanced, Idle Hour's relationship with its surroundings shifted as well. Oakdale itself evolved, slowly transitioning from rural seclusion to something more connected and visible. The estate's once remote presence became harder to ignore as infrastructure expanded around it. What had been a private world now existed closer to public awareness, even if physical access remained restricted. This proximity altered the estate's symbolism. Idle Hour was no longer simply a retreat. It became a landmark, then a curiosity, and eventually a question. Why was it here? Who did it serve? What purpose did it fulfill now? These questions did not require immediate answers, but they lingered. Within the Vanderbilt family, generational differences also began to surface. Younger members did not share the same attachment to static monuments of wealth. Their interests were more mobile, more modern, and less tied to inherited landscapes. Idle Hour represented responsibility more than desire. It was something to manage rather than inhabit, a shift that quietly undermined its long-term stability. Maintenance costs continued to climb, driven by aging infrastructure and the sheer scale of the property. Even with significant resources, the effort required to preserve Idle Hour in its intended state grew more demanding each year. Systems installed at the turn of the century aged rapidly in the face of new standards and expectations. Updating them risked compromising historical integrity. Leaving them untouched risked obsolescence. The estate existed in a narrowing corridor between preservation and practicality. Despite these challenges, Idle Hour still commanded attention when visitors arrived. Its size, symmetry, and presence had not diminished. The mansion could still overwhelm, still impress, still silence a room. But the emotional response it generated had shifted. All now carried an undertone of discomfort. Admiration was mixed with disbelief. The estate no longer spoke only of success. It spoke of excess, and excess had become a complicated word. This was the beginning of a transition Idle Hour was never designed to navigate. The mansion could endure storms, neglect, and time. What it struggled with was relevance. As society reconsidered what it valued, Idle Hour remained frozen in a moment that no longer fully existed. Yet it would be a mistake to view this period as simple decline. Idle Hour was still powerful, still intact, still operating as intended. Its influence had not vanished. It had merely shifted from unquestioned dominance to contested symbolism. That shift would shape everything that followed. What came next would not arrive suddenly. It would unfold through decisions deferred, attachments weakened, and pressures accumulated. Idle Hour had reached a point where its greatest strength, its uncompromising scale and permanence, would be tested by a world increasingly defined by flexibility, efficiency, and change. The estate still stood firm, but the ground beneath its meaning was beginning to move. By the time the middle decades of the 20th century arrived, Idle Hour existed in a strange, in-between state, neither fully abandoned nor fully alive in the way it once had been. The mansion still stood intact, its towers and wings unchanged, but its role had shifted from active symbol of dominance to a relic struggling to justify its continued operation. What had once been an unquestioned expression of power now required explanation. An explanation is rarely kind to monuments built on certainty. The death of William K. Vanderbilt II marked a turning point that no amount of maintenance could soften. Idle Hour lost not just its owner but its organizing force. Without a single figure whose identity was intertwined with the estate, the mansion became an inheritance rather than a vision. That distinction mattered. An inheritance asks what should be done. A vision already knows. Idle Hour had been built as the latter and now found itself reduced to the former. Ownership transitions introduced hesitation. Decisions about the estate were no longer driven by ambition or personal obsession, but by practicality, cost, and long-term feasibility. The mansion was expensive in ways that no longer aligned with how wealth was being lived or displayed. The very features that once defined its greatness now made it burdensome. Acres of roofline, endless interior spaces, mechanical systems designed for another era. Idle Hour did not scale down. It only endured. The broader economic landscape intensified these pressures. The Great Depression fundamentally altered American attitudes toward wealth and responsibility. Estates like Idle Hour became symbols of a past many wanted to move beyond. Even those who still admired the craftsmanship and ambition struggled to defend the necessity of maintaining such places. Idle Hour survived this period, but survival came at a cost. Use diminished, investment slowed, attention drifted elsewhere. During this time, the estate's internal life thinned out. Fewer rooms were regularly occupied. Entire wings slipped into quiet dormancy. Staff numbers declined, not dramatically but steadily. Silence became more common, and silence in a mansion built for activity feels heavy. Idle hour was not decaying yet, but it was no longer animated by purpose. It waited. As decades passed, deferred maintenance accumulated quietly. Minor repairs became structural concerns. Systems that once represented cutting-edge comfort became liabilities. Updating them would require invasive work that challenged the mansion's original design. Leaving them untouched increased risk. Every auction carried consequences, and indecision became the default response. Outside the estate, Long Island continued to change. Suburban development expanded, infrastructure modernized, and land values rose. Idle hour's vast grounds became increasingly anomalous. What had once been remote now existed amid growing population density. The mansion's isolation, once a feature, now felt like an interruption in an otherwise connected landscape. This shift invited attention. Idle hour began to attract curiosity rather than reverence. It became a subject of speculation, rumors, and proposals. Some saw potential for reuse. Others saw financial opportunity. Still others viewed it as an obstacle, an oversized relic occupying land that could serve more practical purposes. The estate no longer controlled how it was discussed. That loss of narrative authority mattered. Preservation conversations emerged, though not with urgency or consensus. Idle hour was undeniably significant, but significance does not guarantee salvation. Preserving such a structure required not just money but conviction. It required belief that the estate deserved to continue existing in a world that had moved on. That belief was not universal. As time advanced, the mansion's physical condition began to reflect its uncertain status. Weather took small but persistent tolls. Water found pathways through aging materials. Ornamental details suffered. None of this happened overnight, but neglect rarely announces itself loudly. It accumulates quietly, one compromise at a time. The cultural distance between idle hour and contemporary life widened. Younger generations encountered the mansion not as a living place, but as a story, often incomplete and distorted. Without active use, the estate became abstract, a concept rather than an experience. Abstraction makes neglect easier. It is harder to care for what no longer feels real. Despite this, idle hour resisted erasure. Its sheer mass and complexity made demolition impractical, expensive, and controversial. The mansion remained, looming and unresolved. It did not collapse into ruin, nor did it re-emerge as something new. It lingered in a state of suspended judgment. This period defined idle hour's vulnerability, not because it lacked value, but because value alone was no longer enough. The estate needed advocacy, adaptation, or reinvention. Instead, it had uncertainty. And uncertainty is corrosive to structures that rely on constant attention. Idle hour had been built to project permanence, but permanence requires renewal. Without it, even the most ambitious architecture becomes fragile. The mansion still stood, but it no longer commanded the future. It waited for someone or something to decide what it was allowed to become. What followed would push idle hour further toward the edge, where neglect, speculation, and preservation collided. The estate had survived excess, criticism, and indifference. The next phase would test whether survival alone was enough, or whether idle hour would finally be forced to choose between transformation and disappearance. As idle hour moved deeper into the latter half of the 20th century, its condition shifted from uncertain to precarious, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of prolonged inaction layered over changing priorities. The mansion still stood, massive and visually dominant, but it now existed in a kind of limbo that made every year more damaging than the last. Time itself became an adversary. Without continuous purpose-driven use, a structure of this scale does not simply pause. It either evolves or degrades, and idle hour was doing the latter slowly but relentlessly. Ownership during this period became fragmented in focus. Decisions about the estate were increasingly transactional rather than aspirational. The mansion was evaluated through the lenses of cost, liability, and potential, rather than meaning or legacy. This marked a fundamental shift from the mindset that created Idle Hour in the first place. The estate had been conceived as an assertion of identity and permanence. Now it was treated as an asset problem that refused to resolve itself. Speculation intensified. Developers, preservationists, local authorities, and private investors all projected their own visions onto the property. Some imagined luxury redevelopment. Others proposed institutional reuse. A few advocated for full preservation as a historic monument. None of these visions aligned cleanly with the reality of Idle Hour's condition or scale. Each solution required compromises that conflicted with another interest. As a result, progress stalled. During this prolonged stalemate, the mansion's physical deterioration accelerated. Roof failures allowed water intrusion. Freeze-thaw cycles widened existing cracks. Ornamental stone suffered spalling. Interior spaces once protected by constant climate control became vulnerable to moisture, mold, and temperature extremes. The estate's systems, already outdated, fell further behind modern standards. Every delayed repair multiplied future costs. Public perception also shifted decisively during this era. Idle Hour ceased to be seen primarily as a symbol of historic grandeur and increasingly became an emblem of waste and neglect. Photographs of decay circulated. Stories of abandonment replaced narratives of opulence. The mansion's size, once its greatest strength, now magnified every sign of decline. Small failures looked catastrophic when spread across so much square footage. Local communities began to view the estate with mixed emotions. On one hand, Idle Hour represented a remarkable piece of architectural and cultural history. On the other, it was an inert mass occupying valuable land while contributing little to the present. This tension complicated any attempt to rally unified support for preservation. Admiration did not automatically translate into willingness to fund or maintain. Legal and regulatory pressures added another layer of complexity. Historic designation brought protection, but also restriction. Any serious attempt at redevelopment required navigating preservation guidelines that limited alteration. These constraints discouraged investors who sought flexibility. Meanwhile, preservation advocates lacked the resources to act independently. Idle Hour became trapped between incompatible frameworks. The mansion's isolation deepened. Without regular human presence, interiors grew silent and unstable. Floors warped, plaster cracked, woodwork dried and split. Even the air inside the building changed, becoming stagnant and hostile to long-term survival. Buildings remember use. Idle Hour was forgetting what that felt like. Despite its decline, the estate continued to resist erasure. Demolition remained impractical, both financially and politically. The mansion's construction, intended to last centuries, made removal nearly as complex as preservation. Idle Hour was too big to ignore and too expensive to save easily. This paradox defined its existence during this period. Culturally, attitudes toward Gilded Age estates continued to evolve. There was growing recognition of their historical significance, but also discomfort with the inequalities they represented. Idle Hour sat at the center of that contradiction. Preserving it meant preserving a story of excess alongside craftsmanship. Allowing it to collapse felt like erasing history. No option was clean. As years passed, urgency finally began to surface, not as consensus but as anxiety. Reports warned that continued neglect would push the mansion past recoverable thresholds. Structural failures loomed. Each winter became more dangerous than the last. Idle Hour was no longer merely declining. It was approaching a point where choice would be replaced by consequence. This period marked the estate's most fragile state, not because it lacked attention, but because attention came without action. Everyone agreed Idle Hour mattered. No one agreed on what to do about it. The mansion stood suspended between reverence and abandonment, its future narrowing as time continued its work. What remained unresolved was whether Idle Hour would be reclaimed as something purposeful, or whether it would continue its slide into irreversible ruin. The next phase of its history would not be defined by what people thought about the estate, but by whether anyone was finally willing to accept the cost, responsibility, and compromise required to keep it alive. By the early 21st century, idle hour had crossed an invisible threshold where neglect was no longer theoretical but measurable. Engineers, historians, and preservationists who assessed the estate no longer spoke in abstractions about potential decline. They spoke in timelines, load limits, moisture penetration, and structural risk. The mansion had entered a phase where delay itself became destructive. Every year without intervention narrowed the range of viable futures. Public awareness increased during this period, driven in part by growing interest in lost architecture and the broader reevaluation of America's Gilded Age legacy. Idle hour began to circulate again, this time not as a symbol of wealth, but as a warning. Images of its decaying interiors, collapsed sections, and vandalized spaces spread widely. The mansion became a case study in what happens when scale, cost, and indecision collide. This attention brought renewed proposals, though none were simple. Preservation groups argued for full restoration, emphasizing the estate's architectural significance and rarity. Developers proposed adaptive reuse, suggesting conversions into institutional spaces, luxury residences, or mixed-use developments. Each proposal faced immediate resistance from another direction. Restoration demanded immense funding without guaranteed return. Redevelopment threatened historical integrity. Doing nothing was no longer defensible, yet doing something seemed perpetually out of reach. The estate's physical condition continued to deteriorate unevenly. Some areas remained structurally sound, protected by their location or construction quality. Others suffered accelerated collapse. Roof failures allowed water to penetrate deep into the building, compromising floors and load-bearing walls. Mold spread. Metal corroded. Decorative elements that had survived a century of use were undone in a fraction of that time by exposure and neglect. Security became a growing concern. As abandonment persisted, unauthorized access increased. Vandalism and theft stripped the mansion of remaining fixtures, further eroding its integrity. Each intrusion did more than cause damage. It reinforced the perception that idle hour was already lost. Perception matters. Once a structure is widely believed to be beyond saving it becomes exponentially harder. Legal complexities compounded the problem. Ownership disputes, zoning restrictions, and preservation requirements intersected in ways that slowed decisive action. Any serious intervention required navigating overlapping jurisdictions and competing interests. Time continued to pass while paperwork accumulated. Idle hour did not benefit from process. It required execution. Despite these challenges, this period also marked the first time in decades that idle hour's future was discussed with urgency rather than nostalgia. The conversation shifted from whether the mansion should be saved to whether it still could be. That distinction sharpened priorities. Some advocates accepted that full restoration might be impossible and began arguing for stabilization instead, preserving what remained while acknowledging loss. This reframing altered how idle hour was understood. It was no longer a frozen relic awaiting revival. It was a fragile structure in need of triage. That realism attracted a different kind of attention, less romantic but more practical. The mansion's survival became a technical problem rather than a symbolic debate. Still, resources lagged behind need. Stabilization itself required significant funding, expertise, and coordination. Even stopping further damage demanded intervention on a scale that discouraged casual involvement. Idle hour remained too large for incremental fixes. Partial solutions risked being undone by failures elsewhere in the structure. The surrounding community continued to grapple with the estate's presence. Some saw it as a burden, a deteriorating hazard that consumed attention without contributing value. Others viewed it as an irreplaceable cultural artifact whose loss would be permanent and unforgivable. These opposing views coexisted uneasily, influencing local politics and planning decisions. Culturally, idle hour had become something new. It was no longer primarily a Vanderbilt estate. It was a symbol of American ambition outlasting its context. Its decay told a story about excess, neglect, and the limits of private legacy. That story resonated beyond Long Island, connecting Idle Hour to a broader pattern of monumental structures struggling to find relevance in a changed world. This phase did not resolve the mansion's fate, but it clarified the stakes. Idle Hour could no longer drift unnoticed. Every additional year without action translated directly into lost material, lost options, and lost history. The estate stood at the edge of irreversibility, where choices would soon be replaced by outcomes. What remained undecided was whether Idle Hour would enter its final chapter as a cautionary ruin or as a salvaged remnant reshaped by compromise. The next phase would depend not on admiration or regret, but on whether commitment could finally overcome inertia. The mansion had endured wealth, abandonment, and scrutiny. What came next would determine whether endurance alone was enough to carry it forward. As Idle Hour moved closer to the present day, the conversation around the estate shifted again, this time from alarm to reckoning. The question was no longer abstract or distant. It was immediate and uncomfortable. What happens when a structure becomes too historically important to demolish, too damaged to easily restore, and too large to ignore? Idle Hour embodied that dilemma completely. It stood as physical proof that legacy without stewardship eventually collapses under its own weight. Attempts to intervene became more serious, but also more constrained. Any proposal now had to contend with the mansion's advanced deterioration. Restoration estimates climbed into figures that exceeded not just private budgets but public appetite. Even adaptive reuse projects struggled to reconcile modern safety codes, accessibility requirements, and infrastructure demands with a building never designed to accommodate them. Each compromise risked undermining the very qualities that made Idle Hour significant in the first place. Preservation advocates increasingly framed the estate as a test case for how America treats its architectural past. Idle Hour was not unique in its decline, but it was extreme in its scale. If a mansion of this stature could be lost, then smaller and less famous sites stood little chance. That argument carried weight, but weight alone did not unlock funding. Awareness did not equal action. Meanwhile, the mansion continued to deteriorate in ways that were no longer subtle. Structural failures became visible even from a distance. Portions of the building were deemed unsafe to enter. What had once been salvageable through careful stabilization now required emergency measures simply to prevent collapse. The estate's condition forced urgency, but urgency without coordination often leads to rushed or incomplete solutions. Idle Hour's identity during this period became fragmented. To historians, it was an irreplaceable artifact of Gilded Age ambition. To engineers, it was a complex problem with shrinking margins. To developers, it was an increasingly risky investment. To the public, it was a haunting image of grandeur undone by time. These perspectives rarely aligned, making unified progress elusive. Media attention intensified, further shaping public perception. Idle Hour was often portrayed as a lost cause, a doomed monument to excess. While this narrative captured attention, it also discouraged intervention. Saving a building requires belief in success. Once failure feels inevitable, motivation erodes. The mansion suffered from being too famous for its decline. Despite this, pockets of determination persisted. Advocates pushed for partial preservation strategies, arguing that saving fragments of Idle Hour was better than losing everything. Others proposed documenting the estate extensively before further collapse, accepting that physical survival might be limited. These approaches reflected a shift from idealism to pragmatism, a recognition that perfection was no longer attainable. Ownership complexities continued to slow momentum. Legal entanglements, financial uncertainty, and long-term liability concerns made decisive action risky. Idle Hour demanded not just money, but long-term commitment. Few entities were willing to accept both. The estate existed in a narrow window where intervention was still possible but increasingly unlikely. Culturally, Idle Hour began to function less as a place and more as a symbol. It represented the life cycle of extreme wealth, from creation to neglect. It illustrated how architecture can outlast intention, and how permanence is often an illusion sustained only through continuous effort. In that sense, Idle Hour became instructive even in its failure. The surrounding community faced difficult choices. Allowing further decay risked safety and blight. Aggressive redevelopment risked erasing history. Preservation risked financial strain with uncertain outcome. No option was clean. Idle Hour forced trade-offs that exposed broader tensions between heritage and practicality, memory and progress. As time continued its pressure, the estate's future narrowed further. Each collapse removed options. Each year of exposure compounded damage. Idle Hour no longer had the luxury of debate without consequence. The mansion demanded resolution, even if that resolution involved loss. Yet even at this late stage, Idle Hour refused to disappear quietly. Its scale ensured that every change was noticed. Every failure became a reminder of what once stood and what still might be saved. The mansion lingered in public consciousness, not because of what it was, but because of what it revealed. This phase of Idle Hour's history was defined by limits. Limits of money, limits of patience, limits of what preservation alone could accomplish. The estate had outgrown the systems meant to protect it. Its survival now depended on extraordinary alignment between resources, will, and timing. With only one phase remaining, Idle Hour stood on the edge between documentation and disappearance, between salvage and surrender. The final outcome would not be shaped by nostalgia or admiration, but by whether any entity could accept the cost of carrying such a massive and complicated legacy forward. The mansion had endured more than a century of change. What remained to be seen was whether endurance itself would finally run out, or whether Idle Hour would find a new form of existence, altered but not erased. The final phase of Idle Hour's story does not arrive with a single decisive moment, but with a slow crystallization of reality. By this point, the mansion is no longer judged against what it once was, but against what it can realistically become. The conversation shifts away from grand restoration dreams and toward acceptance of limits. Idle Hour survives not as a living estate in the old sense, but as a contested space where memory, loss, and responsibility intersect. What becomes clear is that Idle Hour was never built with an ending in mind. It was conceived during a period that believed wealth could solve time itself, that scale equaled permanence, and that legacy could be engineered through stone and acreage alone. The estate's decline exposes the flaw in that thinking. Architecture can endure, but it cannot sustain meaning without continual human investment. Idle Hour did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because the world that justified it dissolved. In its current state, the mansion exists in fragments, some physical, some symbolic. Certain portions may be stabilized, documented, or preserved in limited form, while others are lost to collapse and decay. This outcome feels unsatisfying to anyone who hopes for clean resolutions, but it reflects the reality of managing structures that exceed the capacity of modern systems to absorb them whole. Idle Hour becomes less a single object and more a collection of remnants, each carrying part of the story. The estate's legacy settles into something quieter but more complex than its original purpose. It no longer proclaims dominance or aspiration. Instead, it invites reflection. Idle Hour becomes a case study in how ambition ages, how private monuments struggle in public time, and how neglect is rarely intentional but often cumulative. Its ruins, where they exist, do not merely signal failure. They reveal the cost of believing that creation alone is enough. For historians and preservationists, Idle Hour remains invaluable even in diminished form. The estate offers insight into Gilded Age values, industrial wealth, architectural ambition, and the social structures that supported them. Its decline adds another layer, illustrating the challenges of preserving environments built for excess in eras that prioritize efficiency and adaptability. Idle Hour teaches not only through its grandeur, but through its vulnerability. The surrounding community adapts as well. Over time, The mansion's presence becomes normalized, no longer a shock, but a familiar backdrop to ongoing debates about land use, history, and identity. Idle hour stops being an urgent crisis and becomes a long-term condition. That shift, while less dramatic, allows for more realistic engagement. Small victories replace impossible goals. Documentation, stabilization, and selective preservation become meaningful achievements rather than compromises. Culturally, idle hour's story resonates beyond its physical boundaries. It joins a broader narrative about the afterlives of extreme wealth and the limits of private legacy. Unlike museums or monuments intentionally designed for public endurance, idle hour was never meant to explain itself to future generations. Its silence now requires interpretation, and that interpretation often says more about the present than the past. What remains undeniable is that idle hour mattered. It shaped land, labor, and imagination. It consumed resources and created opportunities. It stood as a symbol of confidence in a specific vision of America, one that prized scale, control, and spectacle. That vision has not vanished entirely, but it no longer dominates unquestioned. Idle hour's decline marks the point where certainty gave way to scrutiny. The mansion's final form, whatever it ultimately becomes, will not replicate its original function. That era is irretrievable. Instead, idle hour endures as evidence of what ambition can build and what time can undo. Its story is not tragic in a simple sense. It is instructive. It shows that permanence is not guaranteed by size, money, or craftsmanship alone. It requires continuity of purpose, and purpose is fragile. In the end, idle hour does not disappear from history. It settles into it. The estate transitions from lived space to remembered space, from assertion to artifact. Its walls no longer host daily life, but they still hold meaning. Even in partial ruin, idle hour continues to speak, not loudly but persistently. The mansion's final legacy is not one of restoration or loss alone, but of transformation. Idle hour becomes a reminder that every monument eventually negotiates with time, and that the outcome is shaped less by intention than by care. The estate began as a declaration of arrival. It ends as a lesson in endurance, restraint, and the limits of control. Idle hour no longer dominates its landscape the way it once did, but it remains impossible to ignore. Its presence, altered and diminished, still commands attention because it carries a full arc, from ambition to uncertainty to reckoning. That arc is its true inheritance. Long after its original purpose has faded, idle hour continues to matter, not as a triumph, but as a story that refuses to disappear.